So like Rebecca said, I'm a journalist, and I received an Expeditions Council grant. And like John said, these grants are focused on sort of media potential and stories. So I'm going to try to talk a little bit about how I found my idea and developed it, and then a couple of things that happened after I finished. So my story kind of starts in about 2007. I moved to Memphis, Tennessee. I'd never really been to the South before, and so being a reporter, I started looking for stories that nobody was really paying attention to. And by that point, I had kind of become interested in science and the natural world, and doing stories about natural history. And I started reading about this fish, which is, it's called the Asian carp. This is a silver carp. There's two varieties that are sort of in that category. And I started reading some local newspaper articles that were reporting on this fish that had basically taken over the Mississippi River and was spreading all throughout the Mississippi watershed, basically. And what happened is that in the 1970s, catfish farmers working with the EPA brought these fish over from China in hopes of using them to clean their catfish ponds. Because the thing about these fish is that they're incredible consumers of algae. And so they can actually consume up to half their body weight in a single day. And they grow very large. This is a pretty small one. They can get up to 50 pounds, which would be probably 2 or 3 times the size of that particular fish. And they also, and they breed very quickly. So what happened is that in the late 80s, they escaped into the river, and they filled it up. There are parts of the river where there's, there are thousands and thousands of these fish per each half mile. And so biologists and ecologists became very concerned quickly that these fish were kind of going to undercut the food system by eating all of the algae, which all of the other baby fish need to eat. And they were also concerned that they were spreading so quickly through the entire ecosystem. But the thing that really got me interested in the story was when I started reading about this other behavior that they have, which is that they jump out of the water whenever the water is disturbed. So they're very skittish fish. They have really amazing fast twitch muscles, and their main defense mechanism, in the wild in Asia, if a predator were coming around, they would jump out of the water to escape from them. But in the Mississippi and sort of middle America, the main thing that gets them jumping is boats. And so this was affecting local people who weren't scientists in a way that was pretty unique. Like this, basically. And so what was happening is these giant fish are leaping out of the water and crashing into people's faces and their boats. And I don't know if any of you are from the Midwest, you know that boating and fishing and hunting is like a major lifestyle out there. And so being from the East Coast, I was a little confused at first why this was such a big deal, but if you start spending time with people out there, you realize that being on the water is really important to them. And this girl's jaw was broken and it was wired shut for a month. She was really unhappy about that. So sort of as I'm reading about this, I happened to go to a writing conference and had nothing to do with National Geographic. At this point, I knew I was a reader of National Geographic, but I had never worked with them. I'd never published nationally, never really talked to anyone at any kind of a national media organization. But I met a writer for National Geographic magazine who actually is on the Expeditions Council. I was telling her about this fish thing that I was interested in, and she said, "Oh, you should apply for a grant." And she told me that the Expeditions Council looks for people who are going to places and documenting situations where there's ecological and/or cultural change happening, and a place that has media potential, sort of a story. And I was like, "Oh, this is perfect." So I didn't really know what to do though, and so I thought about it for a little while, and I ultimately decided that I would canoe sort of through paddle the Illinois River, which runs from Chicago to St. Louis. And I decided on the Illinois River because it actually has the greatest density of these fish on the entire planet. So significantly more of these fish live in the Illinois River than they do in the Yangtze, where these fish came from initially. And there were also a lot of people up there who were very upset about the fish being around. So I got the grant, and I bought a whole bunch of gear, mapped out my plan. I sort of picked out 10, 12 places I would be stopping along the way to visit with people, and left the rest of the space open just to see what would happen. And I went to Chicago. I spent 6 weeks in the field, making my way down the river, interviewing people, taking photographs, recording audio, and just trying to get a handle on what was going on. And so some of the things I expected, I kind of knew that there was this rage happening, and it was interesting to me. And so one of the places that I'll just go through a couple of the people that I visited with. And so one place I went to very early in my trip was Bath, Illinois, where every year they have this event called the Redneck Fishing Tournament, which gets together 400 or 500 people into this little slip off the side of the river where there are a ton of these fish, and they have a contest basically to see who can get the most fish to jump into their boat. And so you can use nets and baseball bats and various other things. People dress up in costumes, they drink a lot, and there's dancing and bands, and it's a big party. But it all centers around the destruction of this fish. And so people are having a good time, but it's a very unique response, I think, to an invasive species. Vipers. So someone else I visited with a guy named Chris Brackett, who is a little north of that on the river. I spent a few days with him, and he was a semi-professional bow fisherman, which I didn't know existed. But typically bow fishing, you kind of drive your boat around and you shoot arrows down into the water. But when these fish started coming around, Chris, being an enterprising fellow, decided that he would start taking people out and trying to shoot them out of the air, which is actually possible and pretty amazing to see. And I wish I had video, but I don't. So anyway, again, sort of a strange response to an invasive species. This is a guy from Iowa who came out to shoot carp. This is his brother, who wasn't as skillful with a bow, so he used the little bat. But at some point in my trip, it started to occur to me that, there's something kind of ridiculous, obviously, about these responses. I mean, I respect it. It's an important part of the story, I think, but somehow didn't connect with me in a way that made me feel like it was serious. Chris, for instance, goes out, shoots the carp, goes home, lives his life. Same with the redneck fishing tournament. It was kind of a stunt, draws some attention to the situation, but it didn't feel to me that it was really altering these people's lives in a fundamental way. And so eventually I ended up meeting this guy. The guy with the beard is named Orion Briney, and his son there is Brian Fisher, great Fisher people names. And so I met these guys kind of through a couple of other people. I hadn't really been planning to visit with him. And I spent a little bit of time with them, and they basically told me that before these fish came, they would fish for various native fish. They would fish for buffalo, they would catch a lot of catfish, and they would sell most of their fish locally in Illinois. And when the Asian carp came, they lay out these big long nets, and when these Asian carp started showing up, their nets would just get packed with these fish. And at first they didn't even know what they were, they'd never seen them before, and they had all these fish and they didn't know what to do with them. And so for a couple of years they lost a ton of money, they had very serious economic problems. But eventually, he kind of took this problem and turned it around. He started working with a guy who distributes fish to Chicago, and they figured out that there are a lot of Asian people in big cities on the East and West Coast, particularly in New York and in LA, who still eat these fish. They started exporting them, and they started exporting them also to Jewish markets in New York City, where it's used in gefilte fish. And he ended up sort of turning this situation around and making a lot of money, making a lot more money than he had been making on his native fish, and making a dent in the population. I mean, he's one guy, and a couple other people are starting to jump on now, but he's one guy, and yet he's making a really serious impact on the fish populations in the part of the river that he fishes. Because amazingly enough, this guy will go out and he'll pull literally 15,000 pounds of fish out of the water in 6 hours. Him and his son, two of them. I tried to help. I spent a week and a half with them, but I wasn't very useful for them. But at any rate, there was something really nice for me. I'd spent a week and a half with these guys, not because I'd been planning to really, but because I found something new. I made a discovery that I hadn't really planned to make. And so I want to wrap up by talking a little bit about some of the ways National Geographic can help you tell your story. But I think the important thing for me, I think the reason that the trip really worked for me was that I did a ton of research before I went. So I knew a lot about these fish. I knew all about the ecological problem. I had interviewed scientists. I had mapped out a bunch of characters to visit with. So I had found these redneck fishing people. I knew a little bit about Chris Brackett. I made a map. I figured out where I was going. But the nice thing about National Geographic is that they want to give you money to leave you some space. If I'd been doing this for a newspaper, I would have gotten like 3 days. But I took 6 weeks. And so I ended up meeting people and finding out things that I had no idea I would find out. So I would just keep that in mind. Do your homework, find a story, find a place, be as specific as you can in your application, because that's what they want to see. But know that it can and probably will change if you do it right. And so just a couple of things. Like I said, before I went on my trip, I had published in a couple of newspapers, but not long after I got back, I went to National Geographic, and Angie and Rebecca introduced me to like 15 people. I was meeting people on television and the magazine and books, and like John was saying, it really is this machine, and they can do incredible things for you. And so I ended up working, we made a television segment, I was on the radio, I have a list because I'm going to forget them. I did a lecture at National Geographic headquarters. I started working with the web team covering the story, and I'm still doing that. I met an editor in books, and the most exciting thing for me, being someone who wanted to write for magazines, was I got to start working with the magazine. I spent a lot of time working with the photo editors there on sort of how they might cover the story. And then I ended up meeting an editor at the magazine who I interned with the following summer. And not long after this, I started getting the chance to publish for national magazines, largely, I believe, as a result of having the chance to get out in the field and see what it's like to do this kind of long-form, immersion-style journalism that National Geographic is really the best at in the world. And so I credit them, with a lot of learning, a lot of exposure to things that I definitely wouldn't have had the opportunity to experience without them. So that's it. I didn't go through all my slides, but this is Ryan. There's more fish. That's me. That's a little fish. And if you want to contact me, please do that, or obviously talk to us while we're here. But I'll answer your emails too. So thanks.